looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. In today's video, we are going to look at the duel between linear and lateral thought, right versus wrong, and how procedure gets affected by pressure. And to do this, I'm going to use the character of Chief Brody from my all-time favourite film, Jaws. Now, there isn't another film which has had a greater impact on my life than Jaws. I watched it when I was 4 years old on my dad's lap, terrified at the head in the boat and also traumatised when Quint got slowly chomped to death, and since then I've seen it more times than I can count and I adore every moment of it. But this isn't a tribute to my favourite film. It's a video about psychology, so let's crack on. Now, I'm not going to concentrate on the shark. Hooper sums up the shark's motives in one sentence. All this thing does is swim, eat, and make little sharks. And in terms of how the shark is referenced in other movies as allegories to villains, or people will always say, it's like the shark in Jaws, that's a video for another day. Here, we're sticking with Brody and Brody alone. So, let's take an in-depth look at Chief Brody. Chief Martin Brody was a cop in New York City, but took the job on Amity Island. He hates water, doesn't go swimming, but sees this as a place where one man can make a difference and also raise his kids in an environment which was more conducive, healthy, and with the environs of reduced crime. Now, in the 1970s, crime was out of control in New York City, and if you ever read about it, you'll understand why someone would have had enough, especially with a young family in tow. Brody even references all this to Hooper in the film, where he talks about New York and its problems. So now on Amity Island, he has pressure, but as he says in the film, there hasn't been a murder in Amity for years, so it's a challenge he feels he can excel in. Anyway, shark eats girl and things change very rapidly, and this is where we come to our first issue of the video. Procedure. Brody is a cop, so by the thinking of a cop, he does everything right and protects the public. Brody's been a cop in New York for a long time, so whenever there's a crime, you follow a set pattern of policies which involve containing the scene, gathering evidence, forming a plan, starting an investigation, and so forth until you can come to an outcome. He also uses common sense and linear sequencing when the shark kills Chrissy Watkins. Basically, sharks can't go on land. People are shark food, so let's cut off the food supply and hopefully the shark goes away. Straight away, Brody's brain is using sequential problem solving to find an outcome and solve a problem, and it's something he does time and time again in the film, and come to the end when he's eye to eye with the shark, he does it again. When we learn about policies and procedures in a new job, we open up a neural pathway where our habitual learning is processed. Habit learning depends on a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. Many tasks can be acquired either declaratively, through memorization, or non-declaratively. In other words, and much like we do when we're learning to drive or even toilet train as a baby, we have a stimulus and then we code a pathway from action to outcome. And when we learn a procedure, we accept it as a method of navigating a problem. So let's look at one for a policeman. Basically, drug dealer is selling drugs, so you investigate, question, gather evidence, record everything in documentation, and when you have enough for a warrant, go and raid the apartment and then go to court and give the evidence you found in the apartment. It sounds simple, but many parts of the brain help with sequential learning, from the neocortex to the hippocampus to the different lobes, and what the outcome is, in most basic terms, is familiarity breeds ease of use. Basically, the more we do something, the more we learn, the more we become familiar, the better we are at it. And as our brain neurologically processes stimuli through our 5 senses, we use something called the VAC model. Now, the VAC model is an acronym, and it stands for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. So we process things by seeing, hearing, or touching and doing. This is why we shadow in new jobs or read policies before we start. It's so we can store the pathways in our brains and work to a collective conformity where problems are solved by a universal methodology. Or, in layman's terms, information from the senses passes through the sensory register to immediate memory and then onto working memory for conscious processing. If the learner attaches sense and meaning to the learning, it's likely to be stored. Brody sequences his job straight away after the first shark attack on Chrissy Watkins. The public is in danger. Shark lives in water, so let's close the beaches and keep people safe while risk assessments, meetings and strategies form the next part of the process. It's simple, it's right, and he does everything correctly. However, Mr. Mayor and the other corporate bigwigs are not happy with this plan and coalesce to put pressure on Martin Brody. The doctor changes his report. Then Martin is virtually ambushed by a gathering of unhappy mayoral heavyweights and told to stop shouting shark and get the beaches open. Now, the reason these mayoral heavyweights arrive en masse and also isolate Brody is so they can begin their bullying, as they want to intimidate, stress and force their point home. Chronic stress and pressure can actually shrink the brain, and this immediately changes all of your psychology. Some people thrive under pressure and make crucial decisions which are correct, but as neural plasticity is affected, someone can bend, change, or lose the courage of their convictions. Thank you, Simon Jordan. As intimidation changes our thought pathways. And Mr. Mayor is kind of right to use persuasion, as persuasion is a communication process in which the communicator seeks to elicit a desired response from his receiver. Basically, the mayor wants the beaches open. There's no point asking Martin to do it and saying, Martin, please, just open the beaches, mate. Instead, you gather a posse, you corner, you say, do this or else. You put the pressure on, and Martin feels like he has no alternative. Now, Brody is no fool. He's an experienced cop and chief of police. So, to gaslight and change his opinions via pressure, the mayor uses guilt, veiled threats, and ominous but vague warnings that shouting shark isn't what is going to happen on their busiest weekend of the year. So let's look at persuasion, as persuasion has 3 outcomes, and it's called the CAB model. CAB is an acronym standing for cognitive, attitudes, and behaviour. Number 1, cognitive. Persuasion can be used to change individuals' belief about an object or an issue, which includes attributes, interpretation, definition, outcomes, etc. Number 2, attitude. Persuasion can be used to change an individual's attitude towards an object or an issue, which refers to the categorization of an object or an issue along an evaluative dimension from negative to positive. Number 3, behaviour. Persuasion can be used to change an individual's behaviour, which is the overt actions regarding an object or an issue. And all this persuasion works for them as they shape, reinforce, and then change Brody's mind. The mayor minimises the shark, Brody's authority is challenged, and his definitions and outcomes are quashed. His attitude to public safety is basically turned into a negative, and he is told that everyone will suffer for his overreaction. Brody's behaviour changes, the beaches stay open, and attack after attack happens, and people get eaten, and all because the simple, unwanted option of just keeping people out of the water is ridiculed and quashed. When the young boy Alex Kintner dies, the town really hits meltdown, and this is best exemplified in the town hall meeting. The boy has been seen being killed by everyone, and Brody once again wants to close the beaches. However, the plan now is to catch the shark, which has been jumped on by everyone and their granny, because there is now a reward being offered by the grieving family. Martin's plans to close the beaches is initially given the go-ahead, but under pressure from every single person in the town, the mayor folds and tells everyone, only for 24 hours. The beaches will only be closed for 24 hours. Once again, Brody's duties, etiquette and public safety beliefs are squashed. Martin Brody then begins a journey where his demeanour changes and we see him drinking, snapping at his family. Okay, Michael's in a boat after all, so he's naturally going to be worried. And after a shark is caught but Mrs. Kintner slaps him and he takes the full brunt of the blame for something he wanted to do but was talked out of, he goes home and gets well and truly hammered on booze. This is the outcome of pressure, and Martin is clearly struggling. With no colleagues or policies to fall back on, all he can do is watch people die as his methods are ridiculed and stamped on by. If any of you work in an industry with strict procedures, you will know that there are linear documents and guidelines. And when I say linear, it means they follow a strict pathway which, although it may change direction, each problem has a rationale which then leads to an outcome and so forth, and you must obey the outcome and pathway and not stray into your own interpretation. This is great in principle, and for Martin Brody, he would have been protected by policies and procedures during all of this if this was happening in the city and he were dealing with a familiar problem. However, and this is the case with most procedures, they aren't 100% adaptable to all situations, and unlike their linear processes and textual paragraphs, humans do not always function in linear lines. So, when we have linear procedures which are then met with real-life dynamic scenarios, we need something else to combat them, and what we use is lateral thought. Now, lateral thought is a manner of solving problems using an indirect and creative approach via reasoning that is not immediately obvious. A good example of this is the autopsy on the tiger shark. Linear process is that they have caught a man-eating shark, but with the variables of many sharks living in the waters off Amity Island, lateral thought is needed to manage this outcome. However, the mayor forbids the shark autopsy. He states, "We have caught a man-eating shark. It is the shark that killed Chrissy Watkins and Alex Kittner. It's strung up. Case closed. We're going to cut it down, chuck it in the ocean. Done. Beach is open." Brody now has a new policy. Don't touch the shark. However, to make sure they've got the right shark as the bite radius doesn't match up, the only way is to look inside it. Now, the town wants things done and gone, and this captured shark is a beacon of success for the media, but the problem is that Mrs. Kintner put a reward up for the shark. A shark has been captured, it's a man-eater, job done, all linear processes have been followed, take your £10,000, win-win. However, as mentioned before, Hooper finds a problem with the bite radius, so lateral thought is used and they break the procedure and go down late at night and cut the damn thing open, only to reveal there's no Alex Kintner inside. They then go fish finding and discover they have a giant a giant great white swimming around Amity, and they need to close the beaches and hire a contractor to kill it immediately because this thing is a man-eater, lethal, and isn't going to stop killing. However, Mr. Mayor stops all this and Martin has no authority to make any decisions and is just being seen as being emotive. The town is about to open for its busiest weekend and they don't need this. So, linear problems have to be met with lateral thought and a team is set up to monitor the shark. However, the shark avoids this huge team of boats and guns and swims into the estuary and almost kills Brody's son. So, with Brody's brain now activated into fight or flight, high emotivity and aggression, his limbic system takes over and all the introversion, reticence and frequent giving in to all the bullying and pressure gets discarded, and it's him that now bullies Mr. Mayor into hiring Quint. Once out in the ocean, Martin is in his worst nightmare as he is on the one thing he hates, a boat, and surrounded by another thing he hates, water, and also stuck with two experts in their field. Martin is quite literally a fish out of water, but as a policeman, he does what policemen do. He adapts. So, Brody now follows Quint's procedures. He learns how to tie a knot, does what he is told at all times, and even takes charge of the horrible chumming. He complains frequently, but as per his habitual police problem-solving brain, he does what he is told and doesn't break ranks. However, the shark appears and is much bigger than everyone first thought, and as the situation spirals out of control, pressure changes his mood and personality and he becomes quite frightened. So Martin reverts to what he knows from his linear procedures and problem solving. He calls for backup. He literally picks up the radio and calls for the Coast Guard. However, whilst calling the Coast Guard, Quint, who is none too happy about this, smashes the radio and leaves Martin feeling enraged and helpless. Perhaps interestingly, after using alcohol as a crutch during his stress on the mainland, Martin is the most sober man on the boat during the "Show Me the Way to Go Home" song and Indianapolis speech. With Quint and Hooper drunk as skunks, Martin looks quite sober on the boat really, which is an interesting parallel to how it was back on the land. Trying to stay fully aware, sat apart from the sea dogs and clearly struggling with the ordeal, he looks genuinely uncomfortable in this scene. Now, going back to Martin being a police officer, stress is part of the job and stress can improve some neural connectivity and, as many officers will attest, they thrive on stress. However, as long-term stress and pressure affects the way we think, feel and shrinks the brain, it creates a white and grey matter imbalance in the brain and can also cause inflammation of some areas of the brain. Martin Brody is fighting to stay alert in fight and flight mechanisms, and out of the overwhelming overload of exhaustion and breakdown, he isn't coping well. However, and returning to policy and procedure, police officers are made from a special form of psychological stuff, and Martin Brody isn't going to give in, give up, go away, or say to Quint, "Put me on a boat and go home, I can't do it anymore." He is here to the bitter end, and his own internal procedural thinking is programmed to see this thing out to the bitter end. Brody is tough, but unlike the mob bosses, pimps, and even trigger-happy thugs he's been facing in New York, the shark cannot be reasoned with, and he doesn't have a squad car for backup only a few blocks away. So, following Quint's procedures and Hooper's plans, as bear in mind they are much more experienced, he fights on regardless of the worsening situation of a sinking boat, ineffectual weapons, and fast encroaching great white. By the time the shark finally sinks the boat, Brody is out of procedures and safety needs and is in pure survival mode, and with little more than a stick, gun and an air tank, is facing the shark alone. So, with his brain now thriving under this pressure and fighting for his life, his true cop side comes out as he uses his environment and cunning to throw everything he has at the shark. He eventually triumphs and shoots the air tank and blows up the 25-foot shark, and Amity is saved. It's also a nice parallel to how things would have been done in the city. Out of ideas and cornered, the only thing a cop can do is shoot the perp, so, as the great white charges towards him, the cop returns to linear procedures and just empties lead into it. Brody has been put in this final position by everyone else's beliefs, procedures and linear thinking, and also from all of their pressure and bullying. The town refused to let him take charge of the shark problem. Quint demeaned him and stated he would just barrel the shark until it gave up, and Hooper used his familiarity with sharks and technology to go into a cage and also failed. But had Martin had his way from the start by following the linear policies of serving and protecting the public, i.e. cutting off the food supply and then later in the boat getting some extra help, things would have been very different. However, through other people's linear thinking, policies and procedures, and also through intimidation, pressure and bullying, there was no other option for Martin but to end up in this situation. However, in the end, Martin Brody thrived under pressure, used lateral problem solving and, with his last bullet, blew the shark and everyone else's methods quite literally out of the water. Now, Jaws is a masterclass in tension and drama, and it's also a masterclass in character development, and what I love about Brody is how he adapts, fails, gets ridiculed, and in the end, atones for bowing to all this pressure and persuasion by staring the great white in the eye and blowing it to hell. And let's remember, procedure doesn't mean things are always being done right. Some of the most memorable characters in cinema don't play things by the book, and that's why we love them. However, what I'm trying to show here is that when following something linear and structured, there are always flaws, and when put under pressure, so our brains suddenly change their entire thinking and start doubting or crumbling to pressure, outcomes and responsibilities change dramatically. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. Remember, psychology is cool, so please like, share and subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment or a suggestion for a future video, and until next time, I'll catch you later.
All this machine does is swim and eat and make little sharks, and that's all.